There we go. So I wanted to sort of, I'll do a kind of a quick introduction to my practice, and then I thought it might be useful to just speak a little bit about what I observe to be some common tools or methods used by socially engaged practitioners. I'll spend about 5 minutes on that, and then I'm going to pivot quickly and outline a couple of projects that I've been involved in. So I'm counting on Ivana to give me a kind of a hurry up sense if I'm going too slow, or if you think that this sort of introduction to socially engaged practice is maybe not the best beginning, but off we go. So I've worked for over a decade with diverse communities developing socially engaged creative heritage projects. I work in post-industrial environments, often urban environments, and I'm usually collaborating with underrepresented communities, either in Scotland or internationally. My creative process focuses on durational projects. So I'm very interested in projects that happen over long periods of time, and by long periods of time I mean years. And these projects frequently are focused around the recovery or highlighting marginalized histories. I use first-person quotes and verbatim theater techniques, and the outputs of these processes varies quite a lot. So my work spans media, including performative events, printed matter, creative interventions, and everything that I'm doing is quite collaborative. It sits between contemporary art, or maybe it sits within, sometimes uncomfortably within, contemporary art, co-created community performance, creative activism, and policy advocacy. And just as Ivana has spoken about, I'm really interested to be here and hear everyone's presentations, because I'm interested in creative practice as a tool for asking questions which highlight aspects of our collective histories which are underknown or have been left out of dominant narratives. Okay, so as promised, what I thought I would do is just have a quick discussion about socially engaged practice in general, just over the first 3 to 4 minutes, and identify some common tools and methods used by artists who I observe self-identify as socially engaged practitioners. So it's important to point out that socially engaged practice is there's a lot of different terminology, and it kind of gets bandied about quite a bit. So it's also called social practice, or Grant Kester has written about it and others have written about it in terms of dialogic art or dialogic practice. Pablo Higuera, about 10 years ago, described socially engaged art as a form of performance in the expanded field. I find that definition to be quite useful, and useful for the work that I'm doing. He also notes that the terminology around this is really porous, and that it's an absolutely a moving target. Grant Kester talks about these ways of working as quite discursive, and he highlights the connective elements of this practice. He talks about within these works we encounter a willingness to engage in domains of activism, in domains of urbanism, and that artists are working as collaborators rather than competitors. He talks very eloquently, I think, about what he describes as a reciprocal openness to and a dialogue with participants, and he highlights that the participants who are working with artists, it is their unique knowledge and experience which is essential to the work's content and to the work's development. So just to go, I'm going to go really quickly through these, so apologize. And then I promise after this there will be slides and images, as one would expect from an artist's talk. So if you'll just bear with me for a few more minutes. Some common methods. I think socially engaged practice really pivots around listening, around scoping, around what I would call pattern recognition, where you're meeting with people and you're looking for overlaps in interests, overlaps in kind of areas of focus. As mentioned before, there's a lot of discussion. Kester calls it a dialogic art or dialogic processes. Socially engaged practitioners are often asking questions which revision a locality or a situation. So someone like Jean van Heeswijk, who's a Dutch artist, will go into a space that is maybe under attended to in a community and ask, who cares for this space? Who is responsible for this park or this place? And who should make it better? there is a real focus on collaboration, on participation, on co-creation. I threw this next slide in here, and we can come back to it in the discussion if it's useful. This idea of a kind of a continuum of participatory practices. And I put this in to flag up what I would refer to as participation inflation, where a project, I don't find this so much with artists, it happens with artists as well, but also organizations where they are speaking about a project as collaborative, but actually it's more consultative. So back to the list, and this is me done with this portion. I think a lot of these ways of working are focused on challenging or troubling dominant narratives. They are interested in creating alternate or weaving new narratives back into an existing one, or they're creating meanwhile narratives. A real specificity in this way of working, a specificity of practice. These types of working practices are locally rooted. They don't like kind of plug and play from one location to another. And they are, in my opinion, frequently unscalable. So they are made with and within communities for a specific locality, and therefore, unlike participatory strategies that are maybe foregrounded by designers or architects. There's a whole cottage industry in Scotland, and a useful one, I think, within its place for that kind of participatory collaboration. Socially engaged practitioners don't. It's not outsourcing of engagement. And the last thing I'll say is that the aesthetics of these works or the outputs often shift with context, so they look different. Okay, so this is another quote from Kester. Within these creative processes, artists begin their work not with the desire to express or to articulate an already formed vision, but rather to listen. They define themselves through their ability to catalyze understanding, to mediate exchange, and to sustain an ongoing process of empathetic identification and critical analysis. Okay, I'm going to skip forward on this, but some of the things that I think about when looking at or maybe judging my own creative practice, I think a lot about whether or not these works have offered any element of transformation, if there has been some type of revisioning, if the works have engendered some kind of continuation or legacy, and if there is the potential for new knowledge production. We can come back on that as well. Okay, so some images as promised, and speaking about some creative works. So this, I'm going to, like, as I said before, I'm going to speak about two projects, really as a way to highlight and hopefully kind of unpack, thread through some of those ideas. I thought I would outline one project which is durational, which has been going for a long time, and another which has not. And this is the latter of those two. This is a project called Let the River Take It, which was staged in Livadia, Greece in 2019 as part of Memory of Water. Memory of Water was a 2-year Creative Europe-funded project led by Intercult and Ivana Price, and in Scotland by Liz Gardner and Fablevision. I was really honored to be a part of it, working with 6 artists in 3 different countries. So this is just literally that portion of this longer project. I was really inspired by the stories of the River Erkina when we visited Livadia for the first time during the week-long research residency in January 2019. And here's some images, historical images from Livadia. I came away thinking that the river was a kind of a spine for the town. So it provided everything from laundry facilities to industrial power to an important place for ritual. These are the laundry facilities right in the center of town in Neratrivi. I began asking about stories involving the river, from everyday encounters to symbolic lifetime events like baptisms. And I was really intrigued by a specific image that was shown to us by historian Vasias Tsukopoulos, because it reveals this kind of intimate domestic moment coming up soon. There we are. So I was on the lookout for this image of rugs sort of drying, because for me, this really Yeah, it depicted a kind of a domestic moment, or a moment where houses were sort of turned inside out. And I have to be honest and say that I think I may have, I asked everyone that we met that first week as soon as after I found this image. And I think a lot about those kind of kernels of inspiration for works. For me, this was that, although obviously what I was doing was then looking to see if other people were also excited about this idea, if this was something that had any traction within the local community. And that was also part of the kind of methodology, I would say. We were really fortunate to meet a lot of people in Livadia. I'll stay with this image for a minute. I spoke to Mrs. Georgias, who very generously described working in a textile mill when she was 13. And during a walk along the river, Angeliki Peliki shared recollections from her grandmother, who as a young woman spent many afternoons in the river washing the family's linens. So she mentioned this phrase, "let the river take it," "natopadi topatami," and apologies for my lack of good Greek pronunciation. But this struck me as a really precise and very beautiful way to describe a cathartic action. And I was really mindful that catharsis is a Greek word. It was forged within, ancient theater and designed to allow theater goers a highly charged emotional experience. So this idea that allowed them to let go and leave renewed. So Let the River Take It was really designed with this in mind. It aimed to weave together a lot of these historical ideas that I mentioned, and also to kind of clarify and highlight a little bit and pull in on the local myth, the ancient local myth of the Oracle of Trophonius, where the dual springs of remembrance and forgetting combined to form the river Erkina itself. So this was really a purposeful restaging of domestic activity in the public realm, and making visible women's work, which is often hidden or ignored. So the day began with a sister event led by local artist Elpida Vartholomatou, working with an association of women workers, and they reenacted this quite amazing morning of washing rugs in the river right in the center of town. It was quite incredible. And my sort of contribution to the day and the piece that I made was really interested in connecting that portion of the river, that center portion of the town, with an area of the river which was much less well tended, shall we say, much further downstream. And in this, I was also working with the other Memory of Water artists. There were 6 of us, like I said. We can talk about this in questions if that's of interest. But we all chose quite consciously to focus our efforts in a similar place and position within the town. So I'm going to let this play without sound. Hopefully that's okay and you can see it acceptably. So the event itself was a performance in 2 parts, or a performative action in 2 parts. It began as a procession from Neurotrivi, the former public laundry, where Elpida had done her amazing reenactment, in the center of town with banners and music, and it ended further down the river in a kind of a mini riverside festival. So these are more images of the procession. And once we arrived further down the river, what we did was stage a kind of a collective washing event where local people shared stories and songs about memory, about the river, about letting go. Members of the public were invited to join myself and others in the river as we washed the words, "Let the river take it," out of cloths that were hanging on a line and from a banner that was used in the procession. Okay, there's a lot more to say about that piece, but I'm going to leave it there. And in the remaining 2 minutes, I'm just going to really briefly share about another project, a durational project, which has been going for 8 years, called Protests and Suffragettes. I want to apologize in advance to my collaborators for kind of shortchanging this piece, but I will say that we've had the opportunity to speak about it quite a bit over lockdown, so there are some other resources that are available. If anybody's interested, I can send links to those. But very briefly, in a couple minutes or less. So Protests and Suffragettes is a creative project led by myself alongside a team of artists, activists, and local historians working to recover the histories of women activists in Govan, which is part of Glasgow, and in Scotland, As I say, it's been going for 8 years, and we have quite a lot of creative outputs or things that we processes that we are involved in, and outputs or activities that we do. There's a list of them there on the screen. I'm going to speak a little bit about art walks, and I'll just show you some images as well. We originally, we really focus our research, and I'm not going to go into the content focus, but just to highlight that there is a content focus for the work, quite a precise one. What I want to mention is that I'm interested in this kind of meshwork of women's activism and the way in which women from different protest movements connect up historically, and how we then root those actions locally, and how we revoice them. So we do this primarily out with lockdown. I can talk about that if we have time and questions. But we do this primarily in what we call art walks, which are a kind of a cross between a guided walk and a performative happening, which we've developed. Within these, we are revoicing women's words back into the streets and spaces where they would have lived and worked. We employ a lot of creative interventions in these walks, including temporary street renaming. We do quite a bit of wheat pasting. You can see there, that's us renaming the street after Mary Barber. We work with historical posters. We do a kind of a call and response, which is a form of the Occupy movement's human megaphone, as a way to revoice and resuscitate these words. We do a lot of chalking. We've pulled this from the suffragettes. So this is us in front of John Elder's statue in Elder Park. And as we walk by, one of our members, that's Lydia Levitt in the picture, is chalking, his wife was pure dead Gallus. Gallus is just a word that means like brave or daring in Scots. We also use music and banners. And this is a timeline of Mary Barber's life, again with temporary chalk paint that we've done a number of times. And we're using that really to thread through and weave in the actions, not just of Mary Barber, because this is in front of her statue, but of the other women who were working alongside her, who don't have statues yet. Helen Crawford, Agnes Dolan, and others. Okay, I mentioned we produce zines. I won't go into any detail about that. We've also done posters. And finally, in closing, we work with Wikipedia. We consider this to be a form of knowledge activism. We're really lucky to be working with Wikimedia UK and the amazing Dr. Sarah Thomas, who's there in the top left of your screen. We've done a number of Wikipedia workshops where we take our archival information, things that we've found. We share knowledge using with Wikipedia on how to edit Wikipedia, and then we do these kind of Wikipedia workshops. We've done 3 during lockdown, and we have more planned in the near future. In closing, literally, this is me done. I just wanted to say something about heritage. So I'm interested in the way that Laura Jane Smith frames heritage. She speaks about it as something which is inherently dissonant and contested, which is always a negotiation and a discourse, and which is a process of engagement, an act of making meaning in and for the present. So taking things that have happened in the past and weaving them into our present moment and finding ways to make them as relevant as possible to those localities and those communities that I'm privileged enough to be working with and within. Okay, that is me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. We shall close the presentation, I think, the screen sharing. Or is it behind you? Yeah, okay.
It's behind me. Yeah.
Yes. Very good. All right, so let's see what is the next step. We have with us Lia Ghilardi. I didn't present you from the beginning, Lia. I said that you are an international expert and you work with mapping of local development. We found each other during the Memory of Water Creative Europe project, right? And we collaborated on a couple of webinars. So for the second time in the history of this project and of Intercult, I would like to welcome you and would like you to comment on these case studies which Tara presented for us for a minute ago.
Delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to the discussion. There was so much in Tara's presentation. Is it possible to have Tara's back on video, or is it better if she stays? Okay, thank you, Tara. Thank you for an excellent presentation. There is so much in there, and we only have 10 minutes max for a discussion about this. There's a number of themes and all sorts of layers of elements in your projects, which are exceedingly interesting. You first talk about the fact that in principle, when you initiate a project, you are there for the long run. You're not there for a quick fix. So in your intention from the beginning is that you are there for the long term. But at the same time, you talk about projects that are unscalable. And although I can see why you're saying that, because they are unique to a place and they are developed at a certain time and the process is distinctive for that place. But by using the word unscalable, that worries me, because also you talk about trying to reach those that are in charge of policies. You also talk about policy advocacy. Now, how in your methodology, I'm just saying to you, how in your mind, also in your methodology, how do you square these three elements?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think, I mean, obviously this is the tension, isn't there? So I am interested in durational practice, and I am interested in projects that can extend for a long term. But obviously, Memory of Water was one that was and was not at all that project, because we were on the ground for 2 weeks only. It was like it's a blip, you know. What you are able to accomplish within those types of time frame. I mean, we did have a good long several months of remote development. So that was, I think, a very well planned project, actually, in the sense, because you aren't parachuting in the same way, and because we were working with local partners who were very embedded. So we had all of those kind of advantages. But to come round to your question, I think, yeah, I guess I use that I use that term to be provocative, purposefully provocative, because I did my doctorate with museums. So within museums and looking at heritage practice and how these types of practices can be used to increase engagement within heritage. So, and I know that a lot of people within positions who are policy makers are interested in these models, but only the ones that are scalable. So I guess my definition of scalable is more that it's plug and play, and or that it can be increased in its focus and moved from one location to another. And I think these types of processes are inherently embedded. By definition, they have a specificity of practice, a specificity of site. However, you are totally right to suggest that maybe there is a way to think. It's not, maybe I don't know if that's scalable, but it is a durational model. It's a longitudinal model as much as possible. So just to kind of ground that a bit in something that we saw within Levadia. So my interest, or my hope within that work, and also I think, I'm not speaking for the other artists, but we spoke about it at the time, was that in the focusing of our work in that portion, in choosing consciously not to focus on the amazingly beautiful center of town, but to move our focus further, that was a desire to potentially catalyze some kind of a change. So I don't know if I have answered your question.
No,
Really.
absolutely, yeah. Certainly. I do believe that there is an element of unscalability of this, but the question then goes into how do we capitalize, in a way, who does capitalize on the lessons learned from that? It's always a question of tactics versus strategies, etc. So how do we share that learning can we share that learning for these unscalable? And I believe they, in some cases, they are unscalable, if not in every case. How do we share that knowledge, and how do we filter that knowledge up or within a city?
Yeah, and I think this is a really important question. So one thing that I notice and I really try to strain against is the way in which projects are information things the way in which projects are the way in which the timeline of the project is determined. So in other words, when does the art part, when does the project start, and when does it end? And actually, I think what we need to do is extend in both directions. So we need to consider that these projects start slowly. They start oftentimes, in very subtle but incredibly important and foundational ways in terms of connectivity between different community groups or between organizations and communities, or all of those kinds of, that is seminal to these ways of working. And the other thing is on the other end, in terms of, to kind of more address your question, or to attempt to address your very important question.
But you're not to answer the same
question. I think that one problem is that these projects end, and then, if you're lucky, there's a report, if you're lucky, there's a report, and then it's done. It's like they're mushrooms, so you have this kind of, there is a real lack of, and that I think is probably why I'm interested in durational practice, full stop, because you do have a longer timeline. It doesn't fit well within funding models, is the really succinct thing to say. But I do think we need to find ways to capture the knowledge and to weave those things back in to the relevant kind of narratives, policy structures, whatever it is. So,
but in terms of funding, for example, I don't know how much time we have left for this. I'll carry on discussing, and then when Ivona says that
we have a couple of minutes.
Okay. Now I kind of lost the point. In terms of funding, is there a point in which then the community becomes independent, having gone through the project, and they themselves generate the kind of income necessary to carry on further, maybe with ideas they have of a certain arrival point? So it's a trajectory in a bit. So you start off with some funding on the table. You are there for the longer duration, but the project evolves. And in an ideal world, I guess you want to empower communities to make their own decisions, to maybe come up with their own sub-projects or continuation of projects, which they themselves maybe find ways of funding. Would that be a good result for you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of it is about agency. So who is making the decisions? Who even has the microphone to ask the questions? Within planning, within policy, within, and how do we create more nuanced models for that? Like, how do we use, and how is creative stuff useful within that? I'm not suggesting like art is some kind of panacea, but I think there are these useful models for asking questions, for troubling dominant narratives, for finding like really creative, inventive, sometimes quite funny ways to sort of, or unusual ways, like inviting people to like come, like put on waders and like come into the middle of the river. I mean, the Greeks thought they were very, very polite, but I'm quite sure they thought I was completely nuts.
I like the idea of revisioning things. I like that concept. And I was just speculating at which point the community is in charge, has the capability, has developed the internal capability of really revisioning and going in there. So it's at that point maybe that the artist's work is finished and maybe moves to somewhere else. Or anyway, so that's we haven't got the time, but I like the idea of revisioning.
Can I say just one super fast thing, Ivona? So I would just say, I think that's the question is, but I want to kind of strain against this idea that the community needs to be helped to find advocacy or agency. Like, this is not a criticism. I just think it's important to clarify, like, sometimes what I feel I'm doing is literally just making a megaphone. Like, there's no problem with who wants to use it. You know, there's no, like, it's just about, I think communities have incredible, like that first quote from Grant Kester, communities actually have profound expertise, all of the, you know, collectively all of the information and skills oftentimes that are required to solve whatever the complexity is.
But maybe
But
they don't have the capability of expressing that because they've not been given it through education or at work. They're too busy, I don't know, doing other things. So I think in the end, it all comes down to delivering something which is a community that is capable of understanding the potential they have and is capable of realizing that potential. It's at a human scale as well, at a human level.
I think
I think also that Levadia was a beautiful example of empowering the community. When we landed in this small town, there were also elections ongoing, which developed in a certain way. It doesn't matter in which, but suddenly the politics realized the power of culture and the power of presence. And I don't know if we can say that it has been used or not, but it has been there during that time. So the community expressing the views, what they think is one point in this, but the community being visible in this context is really very important. And I think that by our presence and by our ways of engaging, we've made the community visible in the context of much bigger events ongoing in the community during that time. Okay, so now the time has ended for this presentation, and thank you, Tara, and of course you are welcome to stay with us and comment at the end when the discussion will be with all of us.